Thank you and welcome everybody to this webinar on remote teaching and learning for English, Humanities and the Social Sciences. My name is Jessica Vinay and I'm an Education Manager here at Cambridge International. Just to start off our session, I just wanted to pick up on something that our keynote speaker, Rhonda Bondi, talked about, which was about gratitude for teachers. And that's something that I'd also like to share here as well. You know, this pandemic year has taught us so much about remote teaching and learning, but basically it's really just taught us about excellent teaching and learning in general. So yes, our focus is on remote teaching and learning, but something that really came out of this morning session was just the excellent practice that you guys are showing us time and time again. So we are really, really grateful that you're here and that you're going to share your expertise with us. I do have 3 expert panelists, but we are really, really interested in what you have to say. So I'm going to move straight on to our Mentimeter. So the question that we have for you today is, in your opinion, what words or phrases sum up good practice in remote teaching and learning? In the chat, there is a link to our Mentimeter. You can join using the code that's on screen. Pop across there and tell us your words or phrases that to you sum up good practice in remote teaching and learning. Some really interesting answers coming in already. I love this one that's come up, simplicity. I think that's really, really powerful at the moment, isn't it? That simplicity of delivering remote teaching and learning, keeping things simple. Again, some lovely words coming up. Well-being. We've recently been focusing quite a lot on well-being here at Cambridge. There's lots of support on our website if you're looking for ways to support your learners and indeed to support yourselves with remote learning and remote teaching. This is nice as well, the idea of adaptation. And engagement, that seems to have been quite a common theme across our whole conference. And I wonder if the question is around our engagement as teachers or how we engage learners. And how do we go about doing that when we're all online all the time? This is quite nice as well, competition. Does that work with some groups of learners better than others? Who are they competing against? And again, self-learning. I wonder if self-learning is again for the learners and if that's about them taking independence or if that's also about us as teachers. You know, we've all had to kind of adapt quite rapidly, haven't we, to this kind of changing world and the new normal as it's being touted. So I wonder if that talks about us as teachers kind of stepping outside of the tried and tested ways in which we've gone about teaching to learn a new skill and then share that with our learners. Okay, I'm just going to give that a second longer to see if anything else comes up, and then I'm going to move on a little bit. That's lovely. The idea of listening as well and sharing and having that space in which to share. I think that's really powerful, isn't it? When we think about online learning or remote learning, making sure we factor in that time to share and to listen and just to connect with one another. And I can see the word connectivity, and I'm sure it was to do with kind of online connectivity, you know, Wi-Fi and stuff. But I think, if anything, this year has taught us the power of connection. So that's really positive. Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing those words and sharing those ideas with us. I am going to move on now to my first panelist speaker, who is Andrew Field, who is our e-learning manager here at Cambridge International. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much. I'm Andrew Field, e-learning manager, as Jess has just explained. I originally trained as a history teacher, then developed a range of online resources and learning websites, together with communities to allow teachers to discuss and share ideas. I strongly believe that teachers involved in delivering humanities, languages, and social sciences are far more technology ready than they believe. I believed this in 2001, and I believe it even more today. The time during the pandemic has helped many appreciate the skills of a teacher, and they are even more important in 2021 than ever before. If we consider aspects like source analysis, reasoned arguments, assessing validity, effective communication, these skills are equally valid for analysis of a historical source as they are for analysis of someone engaging in discussion about what's effective for remote teaching and learning. What I really want to look at this afternoon, and the next slide should appear shortly, I think, there we go, perfect. What I really want to look at here is how teachers can use these skills. And we need to apply the experience of teachers. So we're talking about evidence. It is vital to consider what evidence we've got. How do we actually know that a remote learning tool or an approach that you're adopting is going to be useful? What will the impacts with your class really be? What difference will it actually make? As teachers have made use of so many different tools in this emergency situation, many teachers have actually found it a useful opportunity to see what works. It's also been a useful opportunity to see what doesn't work, and that's as important. And this isn't about Cambridge telling you which tools to use. This is about Cambridge suggesting which approaches, which tools you might like to consider, to explore. And that's exactly what so many of you have done so effectively. We need to consider resilience. It's a vital requirement for learners, and it certainly was before the pandemic, but ever more so, faced with overwhelming loads of information, internet searches, different requirements for different courses, a huge range of material. One aspect of resilience, which is the most significant, is not just for learners either. It's for teachers. And as Jess mentioned in the introductions, it's the fact that teachers around the world have adapted and kept going. With different levels of access to technology, different approaches, it's been testament to the resilience of all teachers to keep learners engaged and enthused. And I'd also like to highlight flexibility. In pandemic emergency situations, you may have been forced to deliver learning remotely. You may have been asked to deliver things in a way that you weren't expecting to. However, out of such challenging situations, you will have developed your own personal favourite tools. And whereas maths or science teachers may feel they have an immediate affinity with technology, humanities subjects is actually where the real value, the real added value can be seen. I'd like to share two examples from Cambridge teachers. Firstly, for history, a teacher used Kahoot, but not merely as a quizzing tool. Instead, she gave groups of learners part of a topic to research. They then had to produce their own interactive quiz to use with the rest of the class. And that's the important thing here. It's the changing dynamic of such tools, encouraging students to lead their own learning. The teacher was able to adapt it from something that previously would have required a live lesson, everyone on camera, but instead set the task so people could go off camera, then bringing everyone together at the appropriate time. This is a really effective way of delivering remote learning, not forcing live screen time. Secondly, I'd like to mention global perspectives. A teacher used Flipgrid with lower secondary learners. Here, they were all allowed to use video to share their reflections, but understandably, some learners were concerned or worried about recording a video. So tools like Flipgrid are particularly useful because the teacher can moderate these, they can support learners, or you can make it a choice to record an audio file or draw a picture or do a visual response in a different way. It allowed video discussions and allowed wider collaboration to flow correctly, and that ensured that every learner felt confident to share their views. Now, in March 2020, we provided a few suggestions for remote learning. We put these up on the Cambridge website and shared all the suggestions that we thought might be useful. And this was to support various models, so remote, in-class, hybrid models. And we know you've encountered so many different approaches, but it's you as the teacher, knowing your own learners, knowing your own situation. You have to be the focus. You know how to differentiate and adapt your activities for your learners, knowing how to encourage their very best work in these challenging situations. Now, regardless of the models used for delivery, the pandemic experience will have forced you to undertake some remote teaching learning that you weren't expecting. I hope you will be aware even more of the importance of teacher confidence. Now, this isn't teacher arrogance or the teacher being the technology leader. Rather, this is teacher confidence to allow learners to make best use of technology, to allow learners to take a different role in their learning, and most importantly, to realise that this isn't anything to do with technology at all. And I'd like to end my section on a quote that I often use. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Helen Ash.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to switch my video on, hopefully, to just wave and say hello properly. And then I'm going to knock it off again so that it saves a bit of bandwidth, and also so that we can just focus in on one feature of remote learning, group discussion online. So we'll be thinking about some of the things we've learned working with it this past year, and some opportunities going forwards that one particular kind of online group discussion might just offer us. So to get us in the zone, we have a quick poll. Have a look at those 9 different logos for video calling and conferencing there on the left-hand side of the slide. How many do you think you know? Do you recognize 1 or 2, perhaps 3 or 4 of them? Or do you think you might know more than that? So you can keep the poll up on the screen now in front of you so that you can see the responses coming in. And when you're ready, obviously close it down so you can see the slide clearly. But wherever you come out on that poll result, whether you spotted Skype, Teams, Zoom, Blackboard or more, or whether all of those logos sort of seem to have just merged into one now, it's worth remembering those are just some of the ways that we've all had to get used to talking to each other virtually, in meetings, in training, and some of the options that we may have been using with our learners. And they've all got loads of new different features now as well, haven't they? So one tip that we've definitely learned working remotely this year is actually we don't need to be able to recognize or use all of those different options, because pretty much whichever way we video call, we can now meet in a bigger group, go off into smaller groups, and then come back again. So learners can discuss with each other virtually face-to-face, just like they would be doing in our real classrooms. And that's one of the features learners and delegates to online training this past year have been really keen on. That sense of being in the same room as everyone else has become really important for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, the terms that we use to describe this sort of online discussion really reinforce that idea, don't they? So we talk about joining meetings and being in breakout rooms, so it feels more like we're there and working together. The 3 R's there, top right, sort of sum up then how we've been using these kind of online discussions. So to replace the contact that we can't have in real life, to replicate as many features of face-to-face work as possible, so that as a way to discuss together in groups, video calling options seem to reassure us. They seem familiar with discussions happening in real time, like in real life. But there are limits to real life discussions, aren't there? So just looking to replace face-to-face doesn't really make sense. So we know that with any face-to-face training we've been part of, it can be tricky having to be in a particular venue on a particular day. And though virtual face-to-face can help with some of that, and we're not in the same physical space today, we do still need to be online now to join in, and we'll still need to finish everything on time. So along with the huge positives of our learners being able to discuss virtually face-to-face in real time using video calling, there are some assumptions of choosing this way to work. So assumptions, 3 A's, if you like, around access, attendance and activity. The video calling assumes that learners have internet access and a suitable device at that point in the day, and that attending isn't going to cost them a fortune in data charges. So attendance-wise, we're also assuming they're actually going to be there and present when they log on. So even now, my daughter, Izzy, when she's faced with an early morning remote lesson, will set her alarm, wake herself up, log on, and then just go back to sleep. And just like in real life class activity, even in those online lessons where her teachers have set up breakout rooms for group discussions, teachers can't be in all those places at the same time listening. So Izzy can still, if she chooses to, just sit back and let everyone else do the talking. So although we're super keen on virtual face-to-face at the moment, let's just highlight another kind of online group discussion, something that we might have used as adult learners ourselves, something that if we're already using it with our learners remotely, we'll know also lends itself brilliantly to blended learning. Online asynchronous discussion using internet forums. It's a sort of way of discussing in class and groups where essentially all the conversation is typed in the form of posts. So it's a bit like a chat, but organized within the forum into separate strands or threads, so that all the ideas about any particular aspect are in one place. And then participants can read, consider, reply to each other's ideas when it suits them. So the conversation can develop outside of real time. They don't all need to be in the forum at the same point in time. And it's that kind of sort of time traveling ability that's possible in asynchronous discussion online that's really powerful. It sorts out some of those A issues that we have straight away. So a tip I was offered early on is that internet forums are a more accessible way to discuss. They're not making the same kind of demands on Wi-Fi or data, and you can attend but go off and do other things if you need to without missing out. And of course, they also make it immediately obvious to your teacher if you've been doing an Izzy and snuggling back off to sleep. Because as a teacher or trainer looking at the forum, I can see at a glance overall activity and can go into those different group discussions, just like the one we've got in the screenshot there, and see everything that's been said. So I can draw together all the posts that an individual learner's made and really get an overview of where they are in their understanding. And of course, now I've got time to consider and to target what I need to say. So similarly, learners have got time to think about what they want to say. They can look back at discussions, reflect, check details, ask for help without anyone needing to know that they've done that. So internet online forums might seem basic, but a crucial tip that we've learned this year is often the simplest remote option is the one that can be most effective, because it lets us focus in on the skills, the understanding that we want to develop, rather than worrying about the tech. And because we're not working in real time, that year 11 class might start off a discussion in their English lesson, but perhaps be working with learners in a different year group or in a different subject who'll be visiting the forum according to their timetable. So suddenly, cross-curricular and peer teaching models are much more doable when you don't need everyone to be in the same place at the same time. On a practical level, you can create asynchronous discussion forums in various ways. Some of us might have been using Google Classroom, using the question feature or something like Kialo. Or if you want to experiment with that whole sort of asynchronous course site, Moodle Cloud at the moment's got a free trial option, so you might want to check that out. So I'm just going to leave those ideas hanging for now and pass over to Jane, and then look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions later on.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jane King. I'm a business and economics teacher at a big international school in the UK, and I'm also a trainer for Cambridge since 2007. I feel quite privileged actually to have been involved in what has been the biggest change that actually has occurred since I've started teaching. We have been on such a steep learning curve since the first lockdown, and in preparation for this session, I spent a bit of time reflecting on the experience of myself, reflecting on the experience of my colleagues, and also of my students in the different classes here at school. I have had a chance also to talk to the students in my classes, and some of the responses were quite surprising. In the end, when I'd finished sort of my reflection, I narrowed down what I think would be the starting points for thinking about remote or blended learning. We have had situations here, and we still have situations where all of the children are not in class. Some of them are still unable to travel from their home countries. So bearing all this in mind, empathy. I kept coming back to empathy. And this is appreciating that everybody, all the learners have been through different challenges. It may be just that the Wi-Fi is difficult. It may be that they are sharing Wi-Fi with their brothers and sisters, or even devices. It may be more about being a bit uncomfortable, not being sort of drama enthusiasts who enjoy being on camera. And as one of the girls in my tutor group pointed out to me, when we're working in lessons, we're not always looking straight at everybody else, and this makes us feel uncomfortable. I think that's very important. I was very pleased to hear Rhonda say that she didn't feel that having cameras on throughout lessons was important or even necessary. I think perhaps at my school, we got a little bit obsessed with that, particularly at the start. I think the reason for that was that people were unsure about how students would engage if they are not on camera. It was really a lack of confidence. Again, going back to what Rhonda said, the idea of using language, talking about opportunities, having always a positive attitude. Think about what we can do online that we can't necessarily do in the classroom environment. Support is all important. I set myself the target of trying to learn one new thing every couple of days. And I liked when we went back to the Mentimeter, the idea of simplicity and introducing new ideas or new ways of working gradually. If you hit learners with a whole lot of really complicated processes all at the same time, you're going to find people are going to be a little bit at sea. I mean, you're going to have some people who are IT whizzes, which I certainly am not, which will take all these things in their stride, but others will be more welcoming of a gradual approach. Lastly, I think expectations. We have high expectations of our learners, and this situation is no exception. So any idea that perhaps your commitment ends with logging out of the lesson and then you can forget about it, it's not the case. We want commitment from learners in the same way as we do normally, doing research ahead of a lesson and then completing off-screen tasks or observations beyond the maybe hour that you spend in the remote learning environment. I'm sorry to come back to cameras again, but I have come to a compromise with I came to a compromise with my classes. I think it's really important to welcome everybody into a lesson and having the cameras on at the very start. It is actually also nice for them when they are in a breakout room to have cameras on so they can talk to each other rather than talking to the little avatars on the screen. But it is not necessary to keep everybody on camera, especially when they're engaged in a whole group task and they are working. What are they going to gain from it? They just look up and they say, oh, that person's working. Oh, that person doesn't look like they are. It's not necessary. Now, getting back to support, I have found my students very supportive. One of my tutor group was the first one to discover breakout rooms. And what a good idea that turned out to be. We've been talking a lot about lessons. I would like to also mention something here about tutoring. It's actually really lovely to do one-to-one feedback. Under lockdown, I was talking to all of my tutees on a one-to-one basis at least twice a week. Breakout rooms are a great opportunity for you to choose who works with who. You can vary the tasks. You can be ultimately flexible, and you yourself can pop in and out of the breakout rooms, contribute, offer support, and so on. That's something we don't have when we're in one room with 20 or 30 students. I also got into the habit of using the flipped classroom in the same way as I do normally, but engaging learners, setting up some research questions, hopefully some that can be carried out without the computer, without the screen, talking to people, perhaps looking at books, reading something. Then you can have an individual questioning session at the start of the next lesson. This will help you establish where to start from, again, going back to what Rhonda was saying, but it will also encourage your learners to make sure that they carry out the research and they are ready to be the person or people who take the questions at the start of the lesson. Now, as far as business is concerned, I was quite keen to let the students be a little bit creative. And we talked about business, how businesses cope coming out of the pandemic and the recession. I set out a template PowerPoint document for the outline of a fantasy business plan, and students either worked individually or they collaborated with one other student to create their own fantasy business plan. Now, I had a chance to ask the students earlier this week which examples of remote learning they found the most useful. And they very much liked the template PowerPoints that they can adapt. They very much liked the one-to-one feedback and the chance to ask for help and so on. I was really surprised that they very much liked the opportunity to return to lessons when they've been recorded. Again, that's something that you don't get in a live lesson. At the moment, I think we are very much engaged in discussion as to what ideas we will take away from the remote learning. Just to sum up, I've already said I'm not any sort of IT whiz. At the start of this, I was extremely cynical. We have a very mixed intake of students, and I really, really thought that many of them would not attend lessons. They'd attend, they'd drop out. I thought it would be, the technology would be very difficult and so on. But I have to say, I'm a complete convert. This has been, although it's been a steep learning curve, it has been, as I said, a real privilege. And going forward, I cannot see any training taking place that doesn't focus substantially in some parts on online learning and online teaching. Thank you very much. Over to Jess now.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for sharing that and for sharing those insights as well from your classroom. Really interesting to hear, your reflections on what your learners like. So now that we've heard from the panelists, we are going to give you an opportunity to share your practical tips for remote or blended learning. In the chat, there is a link to a Padlet site. If you could click on that, there is a button, a pink plus button, and you just need to add some of your top tips there for remote or blended learning, and we will pick out a few. We might not have time to go through them all. some really good ideas coming in. I'm just going to pick a few to start with, and just be aware that this Padlet will be available for you after this session, so there will be opportunities for you to look at this and take this away. There's a really fascinating one here, which is debate. I teach geography and do collaboration with sociology teacher, and they conduct a debate about population policy. That's so fascinating, that idea of kind of the cross-curricular links that can be made from using technology. I love that, and I think maybe we might not have done that if we were just in our classrooms, maybe within the same corridor. You might not have brought your two classes together, potentially because of timetabling, but potentially just because the curriculum wouldn't allow. Something else that I really like, which I'll probably pick up in the next session, is the idea of self-care. So walk away from your desk, often get up, stretch, have coffee, tea away from your desk, and take mental health breaks. I think that's really, really positive. In our last session, somebody mentioned the idea of online fatigue. So using that time is so important, to just have a break from the screen. This is nice. Online timed games for participants to challenge each other for the most points. I think that can be quite nice, can't it? Especially in something like English, if you want to do kind of quote retrieval, that can be really powerful. And then this is lovely as well, pre-reading followed by discussion in the online class, using that space more as an opportunity to just share ideas and discuss. I know that a lot of learners have kind of really missed that social interaction in class, and so facilitating that can be really powerful. Again, there's stuff about debate. Lovely. This is a nice one as well, using a quote as a starter opportunity to get the children engaged. I think that came out of our Mentimeter, didn't it, where we talked about engagement and those various tools that you can use to engage learners. And art can be just as powerful, quotes. And this is nice as well, the idea of using music as a conversation starter. And maybe we wouldn't do that. Maybe we're a bit afraid of noisy classrooms in normal times, and maybe now that people have the opportunity to listen more in private or engage more in private, that's becoming a more popular way of engaging our learners. So all of these ideas are amazing. I'm really enjoying seeing them. What I am going to do is take us back into the main room in a second, so that we can ask any questions. So this is your opportunity now to ask the panelists any questions that you might have about remote or blended learning or online learning. Again, as I said, this Padlet will be available for you afterwards. So if you just pop any questions in the chat, I will try and answer as many as I possibly can, or I will pass them to our panelists. Feel free to ask us any questions about online learning. I'm going to start with a question, actually, just while everybody's thinking of one. If there was one aspect of your practice from the last year that you would keep, what would it be and why? And I'm going to ask that to Jane and Helen. If there's one aspect of your practice from the last year that you would keep as we move back into the normal classroom or the face-to-face classroom, what would it be and why?
Can we cheat and have more than one, Jess?
Of course, the more the merrier.
Yeah, I've just got two. I mean, really sort of springing out of the Padlet. someone mentioned music, and that's one of the tips I learned from a colleague, that one way to sort of welcome in people into a meeting is to have some music ready for them when they get there, so that it really does feel like you're walking into a room. And I think I'm definitely going to keep that in my remote sessions going forwards. But also using Jamboard came up on that Padlet a couple of times, and what Jamboard really offers you is that ability to allow learners to contribute anonymously as a way of sort of facilitating learners who might have been less confident otherwise. And I think that's certainly something I'm going to hang on to, that chance to say something without having to put yourself out there.
Yeah, do you know, that's so fascinating, because a lot of the focus on this year has been, what have learners lost? What have learners missed out on? And actually, a lot of learners that potentially do get missed in the traditional classroom because they don't put their hands up, they don't feel confident to contribute in that traditional setting, have really thrived online. And they've really responded to this because they are able to respond in a slightly different way. So I think the narrative has to shift, and has slightly shifted, from what have learners lost to what learners have gained, and what learners can gain from remote learning. So yeah, that's a really powerful point. Thank you for sharing that, Helen.
And just to add briefly to that there, it's actually about those learners who haven't lost anything at all. They've actually discovered the joy of learning through these different tools that they wouldn't have had access to before. And one of the challenges that we as educators have in the coming months and years is to find ways to allow the very best of remote learning technology to come back into the classroom. For years, we've talked about things like flipped learning and other approaches like that, but it's actually been delivered now for the last 13 or so months. Teachers now have more experience than any educators anywhere before, and so don't need to listen to educational providers or companies selling them a vision. They've seen the vision and now should be demanding, where is my great tool that I can use? Where is this thing that makes real impact for me? And I think that's where humanities subjects and social sciences and languages are now in a position really to demand huge developments with technology, because we've done everything now. What's next? What next can we use?
Absolutely. Jane, what about you?
Well, again, two things. I am going to hang on to the idea of having the a form of chat, so that people feel able to contribute without putting their hands up necessarily and speaking. That's in a way a bit of a minor thing, but I think collaborating and collaborative documents have been really useful, particularly when we're putting together question answers or structures. It's a really good tool for that.
Absolutely. This is an interesting point. How can we make it more engaging for the introverts?
Well, I think that really, in a way, that answers the idea of people being able to contribute via chat. That will help to some degree.
Absolutely, I think.
And without having cameras and so on. Yeah.
I think you're right in the sense that, like, when we think about someone who's potentially slightly more introverted, potentially they are really engaged, they just don't respond in that more extrovert way of raising their hand. So I think your point, Jane, about allowing for collaboration and potentially anonymous chat can be a really powerful thing. And someone's said here, you can allow introverts to respond with the camera off. There's lots of really interesting points here about choice. Choice is also important to help students, especially introverts, to respond. There was a question up here about how can you overcome the geography coursework, and I wondered if that's a question that we could open up slightly more broadly to thinking about how do we monitor assessments using remote learning? How can we monitor assessments online? How can we assure validity?
So can I share a couple of moments there? I think
Of course.
is where we can make best use of technology. So with the focus on coursework or other items, it's about exploring ways to make really effective use. So gathering portfolios of evidence has for a long time been a really interesting way of making best use of technology. And it's approaches like that. So it's still delivering the high level educational requirements and still producing the evidence, but through technology we've got far better now, far better at recording the process. And that process where you can use technology to record your starting point, your midpoint, your end point, and being able to demonstrate, here's where what I thought 2 months ago, here's where my piece of work was 2 months ago, is incredibly
absolutely.
and
Really powerful.
It's about finding ways to take that from research and theory and delivering it practically in the classroom. And that's where Cambridge teachers have done so well in the past 13 months.
Absolutely. We've heard a lot of feedback, haven't we, about children being allowed to record themselves, kind of thinking through their responses and recording that and sending that off as a voice note to teachers, and teachers have been allowed, have kind of been responding verbally. And then a few people have mentioned about, you know, submitting writing, and then people have talked about for geography using Google Earth, and that's really nice. And then there's something here, vlog or live stream can be the alternative to portfolio into assignments. So again, that's really powerful.
It's exactly that, actually, and it's talking essentially about great use of technology. So for introverts who perhaps feel they haven't got the confidence to put their hand up and talk immediately, it's absolutely fine to record a video, pretend there's going to be a YouTube clip and record that for 2 minutes and make sure they're happy, and then they can share it in class. There's so many ways to do these things, and it's about taking the pressure off students and allowing them to be as confident as possible. They have to own those processes, and that's how we help everyone to be as comfortable as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's a really good point here. The personalization of response ensures one need not be concerned with plagiarism. So the idea of like the learner being able to personalize really helps with that whole idea of validity as well. You know, you can recognize if a child is literally saying word for word the same thing. Obviously, you would in a written context as well. I think there's also questions here around how to make sessions engaging. So specifically around sociology. So I think the question is around longer chunks of text. So how do you make longer chunks of text reading more interesting in an online context? Helen, as our resident English teacher, how would you approach potentially longer texts to make that interesting in an online or remote context?
Yeah, it's interesting because it gives you lots of different options, really, working with a text online, doesn't it? I mean, first of all, you've got to decide why you're looking at the longer text in the first place, and whether you want to use it to prove something, to explore something, to contrast against something else. And really, once you know what you want to do with it, you'll know how you want to use it in your session. So just like in the class, you might keep bits of it back and ask learners to be predicting what's there, or you might give different sections to different groups and then regroup them in a rainbow grouping situation so they then make sense of the ideas together. Very much depends what you're doing, what that text is there for. But interestingly, from a sort of English point of view, quite often you might be using a bigger piece of text, but then actually want them to take snapshots from that text, so that they might come in with images as a response to it. So the response doesn't always have to be in written form or spoken form as well. So yeah, all the sort of inventive things you do in the classroom with a chunk of text, because you know what you want out of it, you can do online and more.
Absolutely, definitely. There's another question here about how do we assess humanities subjects online. I'm just going to offer a slight opinion of my own, if that's okay. I guess it depends what kind of assessment one is talking about. For example, if one's talking about a formative assessment, then you can do that via a number of channels, obviously getting the learners to record themselves and send in their verbal recordings, getting them to write a longer answer or a paragraph even, and take a picture of it and send that in, getting them to post their responses on a Padlet site, getting them to maybe work together collaboratively in a breakout room, and then present their findings back in a PowerPoint format. All those ways that you would formatively assess a child in the classroom can be done online remotely. If the question is about summative assessments online, that is a slightly different question, and I guess that depends on why we're summatively assessing the learners. Again, it depends on the confines of your exam. You could set them that in a timed condition, and I guess it's one of those things, as people have mentioned, about plagiarism software. So I guess you'd want them to submit that via a plagiarism software if that was your concern. In our last session, lots of people talked about exam.net, and they mentioned that that was a really great way of using technology to assess their learners. Does anybody have any comments about assessments online or remotely?
Yeah, I'd just briefly like to mention we shouldn't rush to ensure there's a division between class and online or remotely or anything like that. If we're talking about assessment, what's the purpose of the assessment? What are the
Absolutely.
requirements of the assessment? And actually, that needs to change the conversation slightly. We're not talking about taking existing practice that's working well and forcing it online. If existing practice is working well, if you've got great ways of formatively feeding back to your learners, you don't have to use technology. It's about the teachers owning the process and deciding what's going to be of best practice for us, what's going to have the most impact. That's really important. It's a little bit like, as we were talking a bit earlier, about what's the impact of this, where's the value. You should only be using technology if it's going to make things easier, better, more impactful. That's absolutely vital. And it's interesting to see a lot of the comments and questions. A lot of them are actually around what's a good teaching technique, not the division between remote and physical.
Definitely. And then there's a question just come in about preparation for exams. So has anybody got any experiences to share of potentially revising or preparing for exams remotely? I guess, again, that speaks to your point, Andrew, about the fact that this isn't just about taking existing practice and putting it online. You know, they are independent learners now, and they've had to be so much more independent this year, so they can take that opportunity, you know, to revise and then come back together in a discussion format.
I think it's absolutely that, and it's about learners now being familiar with the tools that they like to work with, just as we've spoken about how some teachers have found it really effective to use music at the start of the lesson. Learners are now familiar, even more familiar with the ways they learn best, and now they're equipped to choose, actually, I'm going to use that tool to use, or they're going to say, actually, I don't like using that tool, I'm going to use paper. It's that ownership of the process, which is so much more interesting. And a well-prepared learner for an examination doesn't need to be prepared online or offline. It's about the work you're doing and the impact it has.
This is a lovely question. For field trips, which are very important for teaching topics about the natural environment, are there any practical ideas to direct students to carry out some useful field trips to study natural environment topics? That's so nice to think about, kind of the extracurricular. Has anybody got an experience, or has anybody got any ways of sharing getting learners on field trips remotely?
I don't want to butt in each time, but essentially
No, me
Skype
neither.
Classroom has been fantastic for that. It's not the same as going on a trip, but exploring Skype Classroom, because you can sign up to speak to an expert, speak to someone who's experienced there, and it's a different experience. It's not going on the field trip, but it's allowing an expert to talk to them, to ask them questions,
Yes.
to explore. So you don't replace existing practice. We can find alternatives, and Skype Classroom is fantastic for that, especially where they get world-renowned experts and you can join other classes around the world talking to them. That's an incredibly useful tool.
And then this one's been really interesting. Someone's mentioned an app called Expedition. It's available in the Play Store. Apparently that's you can use that to get out and about, and also lots of museums. Obviously I'm speaking from a UK context, so you know that I appreciate that might not be very helpful, but there are lots of things on museum and play websites and stuff, so that can be really helpful. And that can help them go on virtual tours around, you know, and they can watch plays on YouTube. There's loads and loads of, I appreciate YouTube isn't available globally, but there's lots of videos on the National Theatre as well, so that can be helpful. Yes, this is nice as well. Sorry, go on, Jane.
No, when we're talking about exam preparation and so on, I do think that collaborating on shared documents and putting together practice answers is very useful. I have found that very useful. So you can signpost the skills, and then the students put in their suggestions, so that they can then sort of build. It's like building an answer. That works very well for A-level business and A-level economics.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lovely. Well, there were some amazing answers there and some really useful questions and contributions.
There was something there just about parents as well, talking about an issue with parents sort of helping, in inverted commas, with assessments. And I wondered whether actually it's the same sort of thing that we've been thinking about with coursework when we were in sort of face-to-face classrooms, communicating with parents and having that dialogue so they understand how coursework works and the skills that you're trying to develop and so on. It's exactly the same online, isn't it? Making sure they understand it's not about their child getting the right answer. It's about them being able to learn and access, and drawing parents in. I think it's something I'm really keen on looking at over this.
Absolutely. Definitely, that's something that's come out of a conversation that we've had with schools about parental engagement. So yes, that's been really powerful, and getting kind of parents on board is really, really powerful. So, well, thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions to today's session. Again, a really, really useful session. And really, really great to hear everybody's ideas, and thank you for, you know, contributing so well and sharing your ideas with each other. It really is important for us to create a community of excellent practice. If you did ever want to get in touch with Cambridge, you can email us or you can call us using the numbers on screen. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.